The Morrison mansion garden shimmered that afternoon like something out of a glossy magazine. Marble fountains whispered as water fell into crystal basins. Rows of roses, clipped to impossible perfection, stood in colors that seemed almost unreal: deep crimson, buttery yellow, snow white. The air carried the faintest scent of lavender drifting from the hedges. Every corner of the place was designed to remind visitors of wealth, of status, of a world where only privilege was allowed to breathe freely. On the patio, a small wheelchair sat beneath the shade of a sprawling oak. Sophie Morrison, only 7 years old, rested in it, her tiny hands folded in her lap. She had been paralyzed for nearly 2 years, ever since a sudden illness had stolen the use of her legs. Despite her confinement, her face still carried the softness of a child's hope. Her eyes, bright and restless, longed for something more than silence and rules, and today, that longing had found an answer. Luna Rodriguez twirled barefoot across the stone tiles of the garden. At 9 years old, she moved with the freedom of a bird discovering the sky. Her dark hair, loose and wild, caught the sunlight as she spun. She wasn't trained, she wasn't polished, yet her steps carried a rhythm born of pure joy. She danced not for praise, not for applause, but to share laughter with the girl watching from the wheelchair. Sophie's cheeks flushed pink as she clapped her hands together, giggling, urging Luna to keep moving, keep spinning. It was a moment that should have belonged only to them, two children carving out happiness in a world that often denied it. But footsteps thundered across the marble patio, shattering the laughter like glass breaking. David Morrison's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Get that girl out of here, right now." The garden fell silent. Luna froze mid-turn, her arms falling slowly to her seawalls. Ides, her bare toes curled against the stone as if trying to shrink back into the earth. Sophie's laughter died instantly, replaced by a frightened look that pleaded for her father to stop. David stood tall at the edge of the patio, his tailored suit catching the sun. His eyes, cold, sharp, accustomed to command, were fixed on Luna with disdain. He wasn't looking at a child, he was looking at a trespasser, someone who had crossed a line that existed only in his world of power and status. "Mr. Morrison, Carmen's voice broke as she appeared from the kitchen door, her hands still dripping with soap and water. Breathless, she hurried across the patio, her face burning with shame. She reached for Luna, trying to pull her close to shield her from the storm. "I don't want explanations," David barked, pointing a finger at the child. "You were hired to clean my house, not to let your daughter disturb Sophie. That girl has no manners. She has no place around children of our social standing." The words hit harder than any blow. Luna's big brown eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry out. She didn't run. She stood there, trembling but holding his gaze as if memorizing every word, every sneer. Behind her, Sophie stretched her little arms from the wheelchair, her voice trembling. "Daddy! No! Luna is my friend. She makes me laugh." "Silence, Sophie. Go to your room," David snapped, his tone laced with finality. He gripped the wheelchair and pushed it toward the house, ignoring his daughter's protests and tears. Carmen lowered her head, unable to meet her child's eyes, as she took Luna's small hand. The two walked back toward the servants' quarters, their steps heavy, their pride crushed. But as they reached the kitchen door, Luna turned her head one last time. Her eyes locked on David. They no longer held only fear. There was something else, something sharp and unshot. Cable, far too strong for a child her age. It was the look of someone who had just been marked, not as a victim, but as a witness. She was engraving this humiliation deep into her soul, storing it away like a secret flame. And though no one in that mansion could imagine it, that flame would one day grow into a fire powerful enough to bring the walls of privilege crashing down. The garden was silent again, but the silence carried a seed, one that would not die. The kitchen was still heavy with the scent of bleach when Carmen closed the door behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, her chest rising and falling as if the weight of humiliation pressed the air out of her lungs. Her wet hands trembled, dripping soapy water onto the cracked linoleum floor. Luna stood beside her, small fingers still wrapped around her mother's wrist. But her eyes, those wide, defiant eyes, remained fixed on nothing, lost somewhere between anger and hurt. "Why is he so mean, Mama?" Luna finally whispered, her voice brittle as glass. Carmen swallowed hard. Her throat burned, but she forced herself to speak softly. "Because some people, mija, are born thinking they're better than others. They believe money gives them the right to step on hearts." She bent down, drying her hands on her apron, and cupped her daughter's cheeks. "But listen to me, Luna. One day, you'll understand something important. People with good hearts always find a way to shine." Her words cracked like porcelain, fragile but determined. Yet in her own chest, Carmen felt the familiar heaviness of fear. She knew David Morrison's voice when it carried that particular edge. It meant punishment was coming. The next morning confirmed it. Carmen was summoned to David's office, a room lined with oak panels and bookshelves that seemed to exist only to impress visitors. He sat behind a desk larger than her entire kitchen table, flipping through papers as if her life were nothing more than a misplome. Acid file. "You're dismissed," he said coldly, not even looking up. Carmen's stomach dropped. "Sir, please. My daughter." "Your incompetence is affecting this household," he interrupted sharply. "I don't need employees who can't control their own children. You'll receive no final payment. Consider this a lesson in responsibility." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Years of service, endless days spent scrubbing floors and polishing glass until her back screamed, erased with a single sentence. She stood in silence, holding the paper he shoved across the desk, a termination slip that didn't even bother to spell her name correctly. That night, Carmen packed their few belongings into a worn suitcase while Luna sat quietly on the bed, her knees tucked to her chest. She watched her mother fold clothes with mechanical movements, as if each shirt and skirt carried the weight of despair. "Mama," Luna said softly, "I can help. I can work too." Carmen froze, a shirt clutched against her chest. For a second, she saw the shadow of her own mother in her daughter's determined face. It broke her heart. She knelt down, brushing strands of hair from Luna's forehead. "No, mi amor. Your job is to study, to dream, to dance when you can. You're not meant for scrubbing floors. Do you hear me?" But Luna's eyes didn't soften. She nodded obediently, but inside, something was shifting. The image of Sophie crying for her as she was dragged away still played in her head. And the words David Morrison had spat, "That girl has no place around children of our social standing," burned like hot coals. That night, while her mother wept quietly into her pillow, Luna lay awake, staring at the peeling ceiling above her. At 9 years old, she didn't have the language for revenge, but she understood pain, and she made herself a promise, a small, silent vow that seemed to pulse with each beat of her she would never let anyone make her feel small again. The world might see her as the maid's daughter, poor and unwanted, but she would carry her mother's words like a shield. People with good hearts always shine. In the darkness of that small rented room with the hum of traffic beyond the cracked window, Luna clenched her fists and whispered to herself, "One day, I'll show him who I really am." It was the kind of vow that doesn't fade, the kind that stays buried deep, waiting for its moment to rise. The Rodriguez apartment was nothing like the Morrison mansion. The paint on the walls was chipped, the kitchen sink leaked whenever Carmen washed the dishes, and the single bulb in the ceiling buzzed faintly as if even light was too expensive to waste. Yet for Luna, it became the forge where her vow began to take shape. She sat cross-legged on the floor with her schoolbooks spread around her, the edges of the pages curling from use. A pencil, sharpened down to a stub, balanced in her small hand as she copied multiplication tables onto scraps of paper Carmen had rescued from the recycling bin. Every number she wrote was precise, deliberate, as if she weren't just solving problems but carving her way out of poverty, stroke by stroke. At 9 years old, Luna had already learned what many adults never did. The world would not hand her kindness. She would have to build her own future, brick by brick. The memory of David Morrison's scorn wasn't fading. If anything, it fueled her. Every time she stumbled on a word or equation, she remembered his voice, sharp and cold. "That girl has no place around children of our social standing." It was enough to keep her pencil moving long into the night. Carmen watched from the doorway, her tired hands still red from cleaning offices all day. Pride swelled in her chest, but it was mixed with sorrow. She knew this drive came from a wound that should never have been inflicted on a child. The shadow of humiliation. She would fight the very thing that had caged Sophie's childhood, paralysis. She didn't know how yet, but she would learn. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, and the city outside their apartment kept moving, indifferent to her dreams. But Luna clutched her stub of a pencil like it was a sword and whispered into the darkness, "I won't stop. Not ever." It was the beginning of a destiny no one could see, not even Luna herself. A seed planted in pain was now reaching towards something far greater, something unstoppable. By the time Luna reached her teenage years, the fire in her had become impossible to ignore. The other kids at school still saw her as the maid's daughter, the one who wore hand-me-down shoes and carried notebooks patched with tape, but Luna never let the whispers slow her down. If anything, they sharpened her determination. She studied while waiting for the bus, recited formulas under her breath while scrubbing dishes to help her mother, and stayed awake long after midnight, the dim glow of a second-hand lamp casting shadows over pages filled with her notes. Every test she aced, every competition she entered, became another quiet rebellion against the man who had tried to define her. Teachers began calling her extraordinary. Scholarships opened doors that poverty had tried to slam shut. When she received her first invitation to a science camp at a local university, Carmen cried openly in the kitchen, hugging her daughter so tightly that Luna could feel her mother's tears dampening her hair. "You're walking a path I never even dreamed of," Carmen whispered. "Promise me, Luna, no matter how high you climb, don't forget where you started." Luna kissed her mother's hand, a gesture of respect she had inherited from her grandmother. "I'll never forget, Mama. I'll carry you with me everywhere." At camp, Luna saw things that changed her life. She peered into microscopes, watched surgeons demonstrate delicate procedures on practice models, and listened to professors speak about the mysteries of the human body. But it was the lecture on the nervous system that rooted itself deepest in her heart. Diagrams of neurons lighting up the brain, electrical signals running like tiny sparks through the spinal cord. It was like a hidden language of life itself. She remembered Sophie, small hands clapping in a wheelchair, her laughter ringing in the garden before it was silenced. The thought of children trapped in bodies that refused to move lit something inside her. While others marveled at the complexity of biology, Luna whispered to herself, "I will learn this. I will heal this." Back at home, she told Carmen her dream. "Mama, I want to be a doctor, not just any doctor. A doctor who helps children walk again." Carmen's eyes widened, then softened. She reached for her daughter's face, her hands rough from years of scrubbing floors. "Mija, that's not just a dream, that's a calling. But it will be hard. Harder than anything you can imagine." Luna nodded without hesitation. "I'm not afraid." In high school, she devoured every science book she could find, borrowing from libraries, sometimes sneaking into the college campus to sit in on lectures she wasn't enrolled in. Her notebooks filled with sketches of spines, diagrams of nerves, and notes written so tightly they looked like secrets. Her classmates teased her, called her the girl who thinks she's a scientist. But Luna only smiled. She knew exactly what she was doing. At 16, she won a national essay contest on advancements in pediatric neurology. The prize was a scholarship interview with one of the most prestigious preparatory academies in the country. On the day of the interview, Carmen ironed Luna's blouse 3 times, smoothing out wrinkles. With trembling hands, when Luna walked into the room, facing a panel of professors in suits and glasses, she wasn't intimidated. She carried with her not just knowledge, but years of silent promises. She spoke about the injustice of children trapped in bodies they couldn't control, about her dream to develop new treatments for paralysis, and about the responsibility of turning pain into purpose. By the time she finished, the room was silent, not because they doubted her, but because they were moved. One professor leaned back and said, almost in awe, "Miss Rodriguez, you don't just want to study medicine, you want to change it." Luna left that room with a full scholarship. That night, in their tiny kitchen, Carmen lit a single candle and set down 2 plates of rice and beans. "It's not much," she said, "but tonight we celebrate." Luna smiled through tears. She had taken her first real step toward the white coat she had dreamed of. The road ahead was long, but she no longer saw herself as the girl who had been humiliated in a garden. She was becoming something else, someone with the power to write her own story. And though she didn't know it yet, every hour she studied, every sacrifice she made, was carrying her closer to the day fate would bring her face to face with the Morrison family once more. The first signs came quietly, like shadows slipping through a half-open door. Carmen began coughing late at night, muffling the sound into her pillow so Luna wouldn't worry. At first she explained it away, just exhaustion, just dust from too many long shifts scrubbing unfamiliar offices. But Luna noticed. She always noticed. She saw the way her mother's hands shook when she tried to lift a heavy pot, the way her smile faltered when pain rippled across her chest. By then, Luna was already in medical school, one of the youngest students in her class. She juggled lectures, labs, and hospital round. With part-time jobs, tutoring and translating just to cover what scholarships did not. But every weekend she returned to their small apartment, walking through the peeling doorway with groceries tucked under her arm, determined to carry her mother's burdens. One Saturday, she found Carmen sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a half-finished cup of tea. The steam had long since faded. Carmen's skin looked pale, almost gray. "Mama, what's wrong?" Luna asked, dropping her bag and rushing to her side. Carmen tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "It's nothing, mija. I'm just tired." But when she reached for her cup, her hand shook so badly that the tea spilled. That was the moment Luna's world tilted. She grabbed her mother's arm, feeling the thinness of it, the way her bones seemed sharper than they had been. She didn't need a diagnosis to know. Her training had already given her enough, but she prayed she was wrong. The hospital confirmed her worst fear, stage 3 cancer. Treatable, perhaps with the right insurance, with the right money, with the right timing. But they had none of those things. Carmen's decades of working without proper wages, without benefits, without the dignity of fair employment had left her unprotected. The system had already decided she wasn't worth saving. Luna sat at her mother's bedside in the public ward, the beeping of old monitors filling the silence. Rage boiled inside her chest as she remembered David Morrison's voice, cold and dismissive, all those years ago. No place, no manners, no worth. He had cut her mother's future in half, and now she was paying the price. Carmen, though frail, reached for Luna's hand. "Don't let this break you," she whispered. "Promise me you'll keep going. Promise me you'll finish what you started." Tears blurred Luna's vision. "Mama, I can't do this without you." "Yes, you can," Carmen insisted, her voice fierce even in weakness. "You're stronger than me, stronger than anyone I've ever known. You're meant for more, Luna. Don't let my story be the end. Make it the beginning of something greater." Weeks passed in a blur of treatments they could barely afford, of nights Luna studied by her mother's side, whispering medical terms as if knowledge itself might ward off death. But the disease moved faster than hope. One cold dawn, as the first light of morning painted the hospital walls in gray, Carmen's breaths grew shallow. She clutched her daughter's hand, her eyes glassy yet filled with love. "Remember what I told you," she murmured. "People with good hearts always find a way to shine." Then she was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable, a silence that screamed louder than any words. Luna sat frozen, her hands still wrapped around her mother's cooling fingers. The world felt as though it had ended, but in that devastation, something unyielding was born. Grief sharpened into resolve. Luna buried her mother with borrowed money and carried her memory like armor. She poured herself into her studies with a ferocity that frightened even her professors. Every child she treated became a tribute to Carmen. Every exam she passed was a step on the staircase her mother had built with her sacrifices. She was no longer just climbing for herself. She was climbing for every cleaning lady who had ever been dismissed, every child who had been told they didn't belong, every family crushed under the arrogance of men like David Morrison. And deep inside, she knew one day, whether fate brought it or she had to carve the path herself, she would face him again. And when that day came, she would not be the powerless little girl he once humiliated. She would be the woman he could never break. The morning began like any other at Children's Hope Hospital. The corridors hummed with the steady rhythm of machines, the echo of hurried footsteps, and the quiet murmur of families waiting for news. Luna Rodriguez walked with her usual calm stride, a white coat flowing behind her, stethoscope resting against her chest like a badge of earned authority. At 29, she was already one of the youngest pediatric neurosurgeons in the country. Her colleagues respected her brilliance, her patients adored her kindness, and yet, beneath the polished surface, there lived a fire, one born from years of scars and silent promises. She carried a stack of files into her office, her eyes scanning the names with practiced efficiency. Most were children with congenital disorders or accident-related injuries. She had trained herself to remain professional, to separate her emotions from her work, but when she reached the last folder, her fingers hesitated. The name on the cover sent a tremor through her hands, Sophie Morrison. Her eyes widened, her pulse quickening. She sat down slowly, opening the file as though it might burn her. The words blurred for a moment, her mind racing back to that sunlit garden, the laughter, the dance, the sudden crack of her father's voice silencing everything. Sophie, at 7 years old, reaching out from her wheelchair with tears streaming down her face, begging her father not to send Luna away. Now here she was, 20 years later. Sophie Morrison, age 27. Diagnosis: progressive partial paralysis caused by a rare degenerative neurological condition. Prognosis: rapid deterioration without surgical intervention. Required procedure: experimental neurosurgery. Surgeon of choice: Dr. Luna Rodriguez. Luna's breath caught. Of all the hospitals, of all the doctors, fate had delivered Sophie back into her hands, and tied to that name, unavoidably, was another, father, David Morrison, emergency C. Contact, David Morrison. Her lips curled into a humorless smile. It felt almost like the universe itself had been waiting with her, storing away the injustice of that day, until the scales could be balanced. The little girl once dismissed as unworthy was now the only person in the country capable of saving the millionaire's daughter. For a long moment, she sat in silence, letting the weight of it settle over her. She remembered her mother's voice on her deathbed, whispering about people born thinking they were better and how those with good hearts would always shine. She remembered her own vow as a child, fists clenched in the dark, promising she would never be powerless again. Now the tables had turned so completely it was almost poetic. Her hand hovered over the phone. She could have delayed, she could have ignored the file, let another doctor take over. But no, this was her moment. The past had found its way back to her, and she would not run from it. She dialed the number listed on the file. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Then a voice answered, older, deeper, but unmistakable. Morrison? Luna steadied her tone, calm, professional. Mr. Morrison, this is Dr. Luna Rodriguez, neurosurgeon at Children's Hope. I need to discuss your daughter's case. There was silence on the line, long enough that Luna wondered if he had dropped the phone. Then his voice came again, slower this time. Rodriguez, that name sounds familiar. I imagine it would, she replied evenly. My mother was Carmen Rodriguez. She worked in your house many years ago. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. She could almost hear the gears grinding in his memory, dragging him back to that summer afternoon in the garden. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sharp edge of disbelief. You're that cleaning lady's daughter. Luna leaned back in her chair, her heart steady, her words like steel. Yes, I am Carmen Rodriguez's daughter, and now, Mr. Morrison, I am the only surgeon who can save your daughter's life. On the other end of the line, she heard his breath hitch. For the first time, David Morrison, the man who had once spoken down to her as though she were less than human, was silent. She could almost see him gripping the phone, pride warring with desperation, arrogance bending beneath the weight of reality. Luna's lips curved faintly. You need me now. And the difference is, this time, I make the rules. She ended the call before he could respond, her hand trembling slightly as she set the receiver down. The silence in her office roared with meaning. The stage was set. After 2 decades of waiting, the past and the present had finally collided. And though Sophie's life was at stake, Luna could feel something deeper stirring. The chance not just for justice, but for transformation. She would see exactly what kind of man David Morrison became when his world depended on the very girl he once tried to break. David Morrison stood in his office, phone still pressed to his ear long after the line had gone dead. The silence in the room was thick, almost mocking. His hand trembled, though he forced it to steady against the polished mahogany desk. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he felt something foreign coursing through his veins. Not anger, not superiority, but fear. He had recognized her voice the moment she said her mother's name. Carmen Rodriguez, the maid he had dismissed without hesitation, the woman whose daughter had dared to dance in his garden with Sophie. The humiliation on that child's face, her wide brown eyes burning as he dragged his daughter away, came rushing back with brutal clarity. And now, that very girl stood on the other side of his world, a gatekeeper to Sophie's life. David paced the length of the office, the city skyline glittering through the glass behind him. He had built an empire on control, on bending people to his will, on making sure he always had the last word. Yet Luna Rodriguez had cut his pride in half with a single sentence. This time, I make the rules. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, slamming his fist onto the desk. The door opened softly, and Sophie appeared, her frame thinner than he remembered, her steps unsteady even with the help of her cane. Her illness had been advancing fast. She leaned against the doorframe, studying her father's pale face. Who was that on the phone? She asked quietly. David hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to explaining himself, not to business partners, not to employees, and certainly not to his daughter. But Sophie's sharp eyes demanded the truth. Your doctor, he said finally. Her brow furrowed. Dr. Rodriguez? He flinched at the name. Yes. Sophie stepped into the room, lowering herself into the leather chair across from his desk. I read about her last week, she said. She's one of the youngest neurosurgeons in the country. People call her a miracle worker. She's the only one who specializes in this procedure. Dad, this is good news. David looked away, his jaw tightening. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. He ran a hand through his gray hair, every line of his face etched deeper with the weight of memory. Her mother worked here years ago, and Luna, He He trailed off, ashamed of the words he couldn't bring himself to say. Sophie leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's the girl from the garden, isn't she?" The question struck him like a blade. He met his daughter's gaze, saw the truth dawning in her eyes, and knew there was no point denying it. Sophie had always been quick, her mind too sharp to be fooled. Her face softy, Ned with something between wonder and sorrow. "I remember her. She made me laugh when no one else could, and you sent her away." David opened his mouth to justify himself, but the words died. What excuse could cover the cruelty of that day? Sophie shook her head slowly, her voice trembling. "And now she's the only one who can help me walk again." The silence between them was suffocating. For the first time, Sophie looked at her father not with admiration, but with disappointment. It cut deeper than any accusation. Meanwhile, across town, Luna sat in her office at the hospital, staring at Sophie's file once more. She had heard the weakness in David's voice, the hesitation of a man unaccustomed to needing anyone. She could picture him now, furious, desperate, unraveling, and she felt no guilt in it. Still, when she thought of Sophie, her heart softened. That little girl's laughter had been the only bright thing in the Morrison mansion. Sophie had been innocent then, and she was innocent now. Luna would not punish her for her father's sins, but she also wouldn't waste the chance fate had handed her. She leaned back in her chair, whispering into the empty room. This time, he learns what it feels like to depend on someone he once called worthless. The stage was set, pride was cracking, secrets were stirring, and the past was beginning to demand payment. The dance that had been silenced 20 years ago was about to resume, and this time, Luna would lead. The following morning, the automatic doors of Children's Hope Hospital slid open with a soft hiss, and in swept David Morrison as though the place belonged to him. His Italian leather shoes struck the polished floor with sharp precision, his $2,000 suit immaculate, his silver hair combed back like a crown. Heads turned as he strode past the waiting families, but not with admiration. His arrogance carried a weight that pressed on the room like an unwanted shadow. At the reception desk, Rosa, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and decades of hospital work behind her, looked up. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" David leaned forward, his presence towering over her. "I need to speak to the medical director. Now. This is about my daughter, Sophie Morrison." Rosa glanced at her computer. "Dr. Williams is in surgery at the moment, but Dr. Rodriguez, the neurosurgeon handling your daughter's case, is available to meet in 15 minutes. His jaw tightened. "I didn't come here to waste time with subordinates. I said I want the medical director." The word subordinates landed heavy. Rosa's lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen this type before, men who measured human worth in dollars and status. She refused to let her patients slip, but her voice carried quiet steel. "Sir, Dr. Rodriguez is not a subordinate. She is one of the leading neurosurgeons in the country. Your daughter is in very capable hands." David's eyes narrowed. He lowered his voice, sharp as a knife. "Listen carefully. I can buy this entire hospital if I choose. My daughter will not be left to the whims of some doctor who—" He stopped himself, but Rosa caught the sneer in his tone, the unspoken prejudice hidden between his words. Without a word, she pressed a discreet button beneath her desk, a silent signal to Luna's office. Upstairs, Luna had been watching the cameras. She saw him, the same proud posture, the same dismissive sneer, older now but unchanged. Time hadn't softened him. If anything, it had calcified his arrogance. She rose from her chair, adjusting her white coat, her face calm, her steps measured. When she entered the reception area, David turned. Their eyes met, and for a fraction of a second the past flickered between them, the garden, the dance, the humiliation. But now Luna stood taller, steady, her presence commanding in a way he had not expected. "Mr. Morrison," she said smoothly, her tone professional. "I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I'll be handling Sophie's surgery." He stiffened. "I asked for the director." Luna's expression didn't waver. "And you're speaking to the person in charge of your daughter's treatment, which in this hospital is far more important than titles." Behind her words was a quiet finality, a reminder that here, within these walls, his power meant nothing. Sophie appeared just then, wheeled down by a nurse. Her face lit up when she saw Luna. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said with relief, "I've read about you. You're the best. I'm glad you're here." Luna's features softened for the first time, warmth flickering in her eyes. "Hello, Sophie. We'll talk more soon. I promise I'll do everything I can to help you." David bristled. "Sophie, we'll discuss this later. I haven't approved anything yet." But Sophie shook her head, determination flashing in her tired eyes. Dad, you don't get to choose this time. My life is mine, and I trust her. The words struck David like a blow. For years he had been the unquestioned authority, but here was his daughter, his only daughter, siding with the maid's child. Luna turned to him, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut. I suggest we discuss treatment options in my office, unless, of course, you'd prefer to wait 3 weeks for the next available specialist in Boston. But I must warn you, throughout 8 weeks might be too late. Sophie's hand clutched the armrest of her wheelchair. Dad, please, don't waste time. For a moment, David stood frozen, torn between pride and desperation. But Luna could see it, the cracks forming. She had waited 20 years for this moment, and now the balance of power had shifted. The man who once forced her from his garden now stood in her hospital, cornered by circumstance, powerless before the girl he had dismissed as unworthy. She gestured toward the hallway. This way, Mr. Morrison. It's time we talked about your daughter's future. Her eyes lingered on his for a heartbeat longer, steady and unflinching. And in that gaze, David understood something chilling. The past he thought forgotten had returned, and this time, he was the one with no escape. David followed Luna down the polished corridor, his steps echoing with restless impatience. He hated being led anywhere. All his life, he had been the one in front, the one others trailed after in silence. Yet here he was, walking behind the maid's daughter, forced into her pace, her authority. He felt the burn of it in his chest, though he tried to mask it with his usual posture of power, chin raised, shoulders squared, as if arrogance could shield him from the gnawing truth. Luna's office was simple, yet commanding. Books lined the shelves, anatomy charts adorned the walls, and framed certificates gleamed under soft light. Every detail spoke of years of sacrifice, of brilliance earned rather than bought. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit, Mr. Morrison. He hesitated, then lowered himself reluctantly. Sophie wheeled in beside him, her eyes darting between her father and the doctor with a tension she couldn't yet name. Luna settled into her seat, opening a leather folder on the desk. Her movements were calm, deliberate, every gesture reminding David that she was in control. Before we discuss the surgical procedure, she began, her voice steady. There's something you should understand. She slid a document across the desk toward him. This is a Department of Labor report from 2006. It outlines complaints against Morrison Enterprises for unfair dismissals, unpaid wages, and blacklisting of domestic workers. One of those names, as you can see, was Carmen Rodriguez. David's hand twitched as he looked at the paper. His face reddened, but his voice was sharp, defensive. That was decades ago. It has nothing to do with my daughter's treatment. Sophie frowned. Dad, what is she talking about? Luna didn't let him answer. She opened another file, pulling out copies of sworn statements. Your company destroyed the livelihoods of dozens of families. My mother was among them. After you dismissed her, she never held another steady job because your personal assistant, at your instruction, ensured that her references disqualified her from employment elsewhere. Do you deny this? David's mouth opened, but words failed him. He looked down at the paper as if it might catch fire in his hands. Sophie's voice wavered, quiet but demanding. Dad, is that true? David looked at her then, his proud mask cracking. Business is complicated, sometimes hard decisions. Hard decisions? Luna's voice cut through his excuse like glass shattering. She died of cancer, Mr. Morrison. Cancer that could have been treated if she had insurance, if she had steady work. But she didn't, because of you. While you sat in this city's tallest office towers sipping wine worth more than her month's pay, she scrubbed floors until her body broke. And when she needed care, the system shut the door in her face. Her words filled the room, and Sophie's eyes brimmed with tears. Dad, how could you? David clenched his fists, his face contorted in a mix of shame and defiance. I did what was necessary. To protect the company, to protect you, Sophie. Everything I built was for you. But Sophie shook her head, tears spilling over. No, everything you built was on the backs of people you crushed, people like her. She turned her gaze to Luna, her voice trembling but clear. I remember you, Luna. You made me laugh when I couldn't walk. You were my friend, and he... She glanced at her father with bitterness. He took you away from me. Luna's heart tightened, but her face remained composed. Sophie, none of this is your fault. You were always innocent in it. She turned back to David, her eyes sharp, unflinching. But your daughter deserves the truth. She deserves to know what kind of man is sitting beside her. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, Sophie looked at her father, not with love or even disappointment, but with something colder, recognition. The pedestal she had once placed him on was crumbling piece by piece. Luna closed the folder, her hands calm. Here's what will happen. Tomorrow morning, I will operate on Sophie. The surgery is risky, but I believe we have an 85% chance of success. Whether you like it or not, I'm her best and only option. But know this, Mr. Morrison, once this surgery is done, the world will learn the truth about you. No amount of money or denial will bury what you did to families like mine. David sat frozen, his pride shattered, his daughter's faith slipping through his fingers. Luna's words lingered in the air, heavy as a verdict. Sophie reached for Luna's hand, her voice breaking. Thank you for helping me, even after everything. Luna squeezed her hand gently. Your life is worth saving, Sophie, and saving you is the best justice I could ever give your father. In that moment, David Morrison realized the cruelest punishment was not prison, not bankruptcy, but sitting helpless as the child he adored placed her trust in the very girl he had once humiliated, the operating. G-room glowed beneath bright surgical lights, their intensity washing every corner in sterile brilliance. Machines hummed steadily, monitors beeped with rhythmic certainty, and the faint antiseptic scent clung to the air. Luna Rodriguez stood at the head of the table, her face calm behind the mask, her eyes sharp and focused. The white coat was gone, replaced by scrubs and gloves, but her presence was no less commanding. This was her battlefield, her cathedral, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had earned every step to this moment. On the table lay Sophie Morrison, her dark hair tucked beneath a cap, her fragile body draped in sterile sheets. She looked impossibly young, her face pale yet peaceful under the anesthetic. To anyone else, she was just another patient. To Luna, she was a thread that stretched back 20 years, a reminder of laughter silenced and tears shed in a mansion garden. Now, Sophie's life rested in her hands, the same hands David Morrison had once dismissed as unworthy. David stood behind the observation glass, shoulders stiff, eyes locked on the scene below. He had stormed boardrooms, crushed competitors, and bent entire industries to his will. But here, with his daughter's chest rising and falling under machines he couldn't control, he was powerless. Every movement of Luna's hands was a reminder of his defeat. Scalpel, Luna said, her voice steady. The nurse handed it over and Luna made the first incision with the precision of an artist drawing a line that could never be erased. The room hushed, every pair of eyes on her. This surgery was experimental, delicate beyond measure. She was navigating Sophie's spine and nerves, places where even a fraction of error could mean permanent paralysis. As she worked, the world seemed to narrow to the point of her instruments, to the faint signals on the monitor, to the whispered rhythm of her own breathing. She moved like someone guided by more than training, by memory, by vow, by something deeper. Every stitch, every careful adjustment was a silent conversation with her mother, with the girl she once was, with the man watching from the glass above. Hours passed. Sweat trickled beneath her mask, her shoulders tight from unbroken focus. At one point, a monitor blared, a sudden drop in Sophie's vitals. The anesthesiologist muttered, pressure dropping. The room tensed. For a heartbeat, David's hand slammed against the glass. Do something, he shouted, his voice muffled but desperate. Luna didn't flinch. Her voice remained calm, commanding. Epinephrine, now. The nurse injected, the monitor steadied, the rhythm returned. The team exhaled in unison, but Luna never lost her focus. She knew this surgery was not just about saving Sophie's legs. It was about proving that the girl once humiliated in a garden could hold the power of life itself in her hands. Finally, after nearly 6 hours, Luna made the last adjustment. She closed the incision, her movements slow, deliberate. She removed her gloves with a snap, her eyes lifting to the clock above. The hardest part was done. She walked to the glass, removing her mask, her face damp with sweat but steady with resolve, her eyes locked with David's. The surgery is complete. She has a strong chance of full recovery, but it will take time. David's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a maid's daughter, not as an unwanted child, but as a force he couldn't control, couldn't diminish. His reflection in the glass looked smaller than hers. Hours later, when Sophie woke in recovery, her voice was weak but hopeful. Did it work? Luna smiled softly, adjusting her blanket. You'll need therapy, patience, and strength. But yes, Sophie, it worked. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. She reached for Luna's hand. "Thank you for not letting his mistakes decide my future." Luna squeezed her fingers gently. "Your future was always yours." Across the room, David stood silent, watching. His daughter's gratitude poured not toward him, but toward the girl he had once cast out, and for the first time in his life, he understood the sharp sting of irrelevance. The operation was over. Sophie had been given a second chance at life. But for David Morrison, the true surgery had only just begun, the slow, painful dismantling of a pride that had cost him everything. The recovery wing smelled faintly of lavender soap and antiseptic, a strangely comforting mix. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, painting pale lines across the white floor. Sophie lay propped up in her bed, her face still fragile but lit with something David hadn't seen in years. Hope. It had been 3 days since the surgery. The first day had been filled with groans, muscle spasms, and exhaustion. The second with cautious movements, therapists helping her wiggle toes she thought she'd never feel again. But this morning was different. Sophie swung her legs gently over the edge of the bed, her bare feet brushing the floor. It wasn't graceful, but it was real. She looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else, tears pooling in her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, glancing at him. "I can feel the ground." David's throat tightened. He rose from the chair where he had been brooding, restless, unable to sleep. His eyes locked on his daughter's trembling legs. For a moment, pride surged in his chest, but when Sophie lifted her gaze, the pride turned bitter, because the look on her face wasn't gratitude for him, it was for Luna. A knock came at the door. Luna entered, her presence filling the room with calm authority. She smiled at Sophie. "How are we feeling today?" Sophie's voice broke as she reached for Luna's hand. "I moved my feet. I can feel them." "That's exactly what we hoped for," Luna said warmly. "From here, therapy will do the rest." "You're strong, Sophie. Stronger than you think." David shifted uncomfortably, trying to reclaim control. "When can she walk again?" Luna's eyes flicked to him, cool, steady. "With discipline and therapy. Weeks, maybe months. She'll recover. But Mr. Morrison..." She paused, her voice lowering to a weight he couldn't ignore. "Her healing won't just be physical. She needs truth. She needs to know the ground she's standing on isn't built from lies." David stiffened. "This again?" "Yes," Luna replied, her tone sharp but calm. She set a brown folder on the bedside table, sliding it toward Sophie. "I've gathered documents, testimonies, records of what your father did to dozens of families, my mother included. I thought you deserved to see them." Sophie's hand hovered uncertainly, but then she pulled the folder into her lap. Her eyes scanned the pages, her lips trembling as the words sank in. Wage theft, blacklisting, evictions, desperation. Tears blurred her vision. "Dad, is all of this true?" David's chest heaved. "Sophie, you don't understand. I did what I had to." "No," she cut him off, her voice shaking. "You did what you wanted, and people suffered, families suffered, she suffered." She gestured to Luna, her eyes wet with grief and fury. "You destroyed lives for convenience." For the first time in his life, David Morrison shrank under his daughter's gaze. Luna leaned closer to Sophie, her voice gentle. "You are not your father's sins. You have your own strength. Use it." Sophie clutched Luna's hand as if holding onto a lifeline. "I will. Lose." Na turned to David, her tone no longer just professional but resolute. "Mr. Morrison, justice is coming. My lawyer has already submitted these documents to the Department of Labor and the IRS. Years of silence will end now. You can no longer buy your way out." David's face went pale. His empire, his carefully built facade, his untouchable arrogance, it was unraveling in front of his own daughter. Sophie's tears dried into resolve. "If you really love me, Dad, don't fight this. Face it. Take responsibility, because I can't stand beside you if you don't." Her words landed heavier than any verdict. David pressed a hand to his face, trembling. For the first time, the king of Morrison Enterprises looked like nothing more than an old man cornered by truth. Luna picked up her folder, her voice calm but final. "Your daughter will walk again, Mr. Morrison, but when she does, she'll walk into a future you can't control. That is justice." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of machines. Sophie closed her eyes, leaning back, her grip still firm on Luna's hand, and David, staring at the floor, finally understood he hadn't just lost power, he had lost his daughter's faith. 6 months later, the Morrison mansion no longer echoed with the sounds of privilege. Its marble halls were stripped bare, the ornate chandeliers dimmed, the rooms emptied by auction. What had once been a symbol of untouchable power now stood quiet, waiting for its new purpose. On that bright spring morning, Sophie stood at the garden's edge, no wheelchair beneath her, no cane in her hand. Her steps were careful but steady, each one a victory carved out of months of therapy. The very stones beneath her feet seemed to remember. The place where she once reached for a friend as her father tore them apart was now the place she reclaimed for herself. Her laughter, the same light sound from childhood's spill, ate into the air as she walked forward, Luna by her side. Reporters gathered at the gates, cameras flashing, not to cover a Millionaire's New Deal, but to witness something far greater, the inauguration of the Carmen Rodriguez Institute of Social Medicine. The mansion had been transformed into a sanctuary for families of domestic workers, a place where children could receive medical care, education, and hope without the shadow of exploitation. Luna stood at the podium, her white coat replaced by a simple navy dress, her face serene, but her voice powerful. 20 years ago, she began, in this very garden, a little girl was told she did not belong. She was told she wasn't worthy to play alongside children of privilege. Today, that little girl stands here, not to claim vengeance, but to prove that worth is not decided by birth or wealth. Worth is earned by compassion, by resilience, by refusing to let cruelty define who we become. The crowd erupted in applause, but Luna held up a hand, her eyes glistening. This institute is not mine alone. It belongs to every mother who worked 2 jobs without health insurance, to every child who was told they weren't enough, to my mother, Carmen Rodriguez, whose sacrifices built the foundation I now stand on, and to Sophie Morrison, who reminds us that healing is not just of the body, but of the heart. Sophie stepped forward, her steps sure, her voice breaking with emotion. I walk today because of Dr. Rodriguez, but I also walk today because she refused to let hatred win. My father's choices caused suffering, but Luna chose to heal instead of destroy. That is strength. That is justice. In a small apartment across town, David Morrison sat by the window, his world reduced to brick walls and the smell of rust. Bankruptcy had gutted his empire. Lawsuits had shredded his reputation. Court hearings awaited him. But the punishment that cut deepest was the letter in his lap, written in Luna, as steady hand. Mr. Morrison, it read, when I was 9 years old, you said I had no place among children of your social standing. Today, I lead an institute in your former mansion, and your daughter is free because of my hands. You were right about one thing. I never belonged in your world. I belonged above it. He folded the letter slowly, the weight of it pressing down heavier than any verdict. Pride, wealth, power. All of it had slipped through his fingers. What remained was the bitter knowledge that the girl he had tried to crush had become the proof of his greatest failure. Back in the garden, Luna stood among children running freely across the grass, their laughter filling the air where silence and cruelty once reigned. She closed her eyes, breathing in the moment. Her mother's voice echoed in her heart. People with good hearts always find a way to shine. And now, at last, Luna was shining, not with vengeance, but with a light so fierce it turned the place of her humiliation into a beacon of hope. The mansion, the garden, the very stones beneath her feet bore witness. True victory was never in destroying her enemy. It was in building something so powerful, so undeniable, that his cruelty was forever rendered irrelevant. The crowd rose to their feet, the ovation rolling like thunder. Sophie stood tall beside her, and Luna, her eyes lifted toward the sky, smiled for the little girl she once was, dancing in a garden, unafraid to dream. The story had come full circle, and this time the ending belonged to her,